Last week I spoke about a film that right from release captured the zeitgeist and is still today influencing modern media. This week's movie is the very opposite of that. It's a film that got released to poor critical and box office reception that gained a small but devoted cult audience on home video. You could say it flew under the radar. I make no apologies for that pun because this week's movie is The Night Flyer. Based on the Stephen King short story of the same name, it was adapted for the big screen and directed by Mark Pavia before being released initially on HBO before grossing the paltry sum of $125,000 at the box office, all whilst holding a 33% on Rotten Tomatoes. Sounds awful, right? Although certainly not perfect, this film has a whole lot going for it. A great premise, a brilliant central performance, loads of gore, a bunch of atmosphere, all while being a wonderful metaphor for the soullessness of journalism. The plot is a simple one. Two reporters tail a serial killer who kills his victims at isolated airports, having flown into them at night. They dub him the Night Flyer, and he might not be any ordinary serial killer. He may well be a blood-sucking vampire. Now, I love the premise of this plot for a few reasons. Not least of which is I'm a sucker for vampire films. Yes, pun once again very much intended and not apologised for, especially ones that try and deal with the reality that vampires are serial killers merely to survive, because as inept as most police forces are, and as much as journalism has become little more than either sensationalist gossip they read on Twitter that morning whilst taking a dump, or propaganda for billionaires, even they would notice hundreds of dead bodies turning up with their throats ripped out. So having a vampire that flies around small-town America feasting on airport employees is a fairly interesting take on the vampire lore. Now, personally, does this make much sense? Absolutely not, because it would create a clear pattern. The kind of pattern that journalists and even the most local of hick police would notice. In this film's universe though, only one newspaper that seems to specialise in the more weird and macabre stories notices the pattern and sends a reporter out on the trail. The next reason I dig this plot is it's a Stephen King adaptation, and I'm a sucker for Stephen King adaptations, even though most of them are, let's be honest, awful. With this being an above-average Stephen King film, which says more about the quality of most of the other films than it does this one. Either way, let me know your favourite and worst Stephen King adaptations in the comments. The trashier the better. The plot also has heavy X-Files and Twilight Zone's vibes to it, two shows that I loved as a kid, and whenever I see anything that reminds me of that, I tend to enjoy it if it's done even halfway competently, which this definitely is. Another reason I dug this premise, this time more in theory than actual execution, is because it leaves it fairly open as to whether the killer is an actual vampire, or just a normal everyday human with a penchant for ripping people's throats out. And I'm not gonna lie, the key here is I loved the premise more in theory than in the execution of it, largely because the first two-thirds of the film are quite slow and methodical and very careful as to not show definitively that Dwight Renfield, aka the Night Flyer, is a vampire, or whether Richard Dees, the journalist chasing him, is losing his mind. Then in the last act it just goes, yep, he's a vampire, no doubt about it, he's 100% a real vampire. Which is a mistake in my opinion. I think it would have been way better had they kept it ambiguous as to whether Dees was insane, or there was actually a vampire on the loose. Yeah, this would have been a pretty major change to the original Stephen King short story, but the ending to the movie is already a major change, and one that would have been elevated by not revealing the true identity of the Night Flyer as a vampire, if you ask me. And if you're going to make one major change, you may as well make two. This narrative largely revolves around just 4 characters, and they are all totally unlikable assholes. The main protagonist and major driver of the plot at all times is Miguel Ferrer as Richard Dees, a cynical and jaded journalist on the way down rather than the way up in his career, who, from the very first moment, is as dislikable a main protagonist as I've ever seen in a film. It's a bold move, I fully applaud, and one that kind of makes sense when you take into account this film's plot is really a metaphor for something, but more on that in the next section of this video. Hell, this guy's personal motto is,
never believe what you publish, and never publish what you believe.
If a sentence ever summed up just how much of a jaded, cynical husk of an asshole a character was, I have yet to see it. He's rude, he's obnoxious, he takes pictures of dead kids, bribes police, and he's just an all-round dislikable cunt of the highest order. And yet, he's the best thing about this film, because Miguel Ferrer is exceptional in the role, and carries most of the first 2 acts of the film single-handedly, where he is largely investigating the murders, and the film's trying its best to show as little of the vampire as possible, meaning not a huge amount happens, but a combination of Ferrer's performance and the film's creepy atmosphere do build enough tension to keep you very much engaged for the full 93-minute runtime. I also admittedly love it when a film just goes full nihilism, says screw convention, we're having a protagonist who cares for nothing, not even himself. But I can fully understand why this character wouldn't jive with critics or general audiences, or just a person who's normal. The movie, unlike the short story, introduces a secondary protagonist in the shape of Catherine Blair, played by Julie Entwisle, actress who only ever appeared in this film and had a small part to play in one other film from 1997, then never acted again, as far as I can tell, actually marrying the director of this film, Mark Pavia, for a little while, I believe, which probably goes a long way to explain what I'm about to say. This is a character purely added to bulk out the plot of a 40-page short story, and as someone for Ferrer to bounce off of and have some form of antagonism with as a rival journo in search of the story. In that respect, she's kind of wasted, as they have literally 2 scenes together, and I think you could have done this movie without a character being in it at all. She's also not a particularly likeable character either, being an ambitious go-getter, willing to do anything to get ahead in the world of journalism. The one other human character that appears in more than one scene is the Inside View's editor, Merton Morrison, played by Dan Monahan, who channeled his inner John Jonah Jameson from the Daily Bugle and turned it up to 12, never mind 11. Good lord, this guy's such a creep he makes Piers Morgan look like an ethical news editor, saying this when the trail goes cold.
God, I hope he kills more people.
I genuinely laughed out loud when he said that, because it was so on the nose as to just how unethical a journo he is. More on that later though. This leaves us with one main character left, Michael H. Moss as the eponymous Night Flyer himself, Mr. Dwight Renfield. Look, I'm not going to beat about the bush. He isn't in this very much. The first 2 acts try to obfuscate whether he is or isn't a real vampire, so what we largely see is the aftermath of him being somewhere and murdering someone, rather than the actual murdering. So we see him fleetingly and in shadow, never getting a decent look at his face or features, which to be fair does do a decent job of building tension and mystery. Then we get to the 3rd act, where we once again see the results of his carnage rather than the doing of it, and then he pisses blood into a urinal, and we just see the blood because we are looking into a mirror. And you know what's coming, right? Because yep, we still don't get to see him even when he stands right behind Dees and threatens him, because once again, the shot is via a mirror. We do eventually get to see his face, and look, it's the one they put right on the DVD box. He's genuinely on screen for less time than it has taken me to explain he's not on screen much. Either way, he's probably the least asshole-ish character in this film, because hell, at least he's meant to be evil, and yet somehow, this band of assholes works because this film's narrative is really a very on-the-nose metaphor for tabloid journalism. Our 2 protagonists are chasing a literal soul-sucking vampire, and yet morally, it's questionable who's better, them or the vampire. If I was going to go out on a limb here, I'd say that Stephen King really didn't like the tabloid press, because this entire story species is what's worse, a literal soul-sucking monster or a pair of journalists, and the answer is probably the journalists, as they're just such assholes willing to do anything for a story throughout. We see and hear both of them do incredibly morally questionable things, such as lie to people that are in fact the police, pretend to be the FBI, take pictures of dead kids who have just been in an horrendous multi-car pileup, and just generally be the worst humans possible in search of a lead. And in the end, do they even report the truth? No, they don't. They lie to make the story a sellable one. The film, at every opportunity, reminds us these people are assholes, because it wants us to think journalists are soulless ghouls, willing to do anything for a story, much like a vampire will for blood. And in that respect, it is highly effective. Talking of blood, we get a fair few decent gore shots in this film, which, as I previously said, are disappointingly the results of a murder rather than the actual murder being performed. They are largely latex with liberal amounts of red stuff oozing out of them, but are well enough done and have aged fairly well, being very much appreciated, and would add at least a whole point to this film's rating if I gave films a score. The cinematography is kind of flat when it is daytime or inside, but any shots in the nighttime do have a really moody look and feel to them thanks to the fairly clever use of shadow and lighting. Both of the above definitely help those first two acts, but do suffer a little from pacing issues. Oh, and there are several connections between this and Stephen King's other works that King aficionados might like to spot. There were plans for a sequel that would give us more of the backstory of the Night Flyer and focus on the character of Catherine Blair and her continuing investigation into the vampire, but due to this film's abysmal box office and weak critical response, the director and producers struggled to find the $10 million in funding they required, and the sequel was shelved. This review probably has a fairly negative tone to it, and that's because The Night Flyer isn't a particularly brilliant movie, but does have just enough moody atmosphere and gore that it has kept me entertained on numerous occasions. Also, its species, that a certain type of journalist are just soul-sucking ghouls, is absolutely correct. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next week with a movie my audience has voted for. At the time of writing, I have no idea which movie that will be, and if you want to see that review, then consider subscribing to the channel.